My wife always says I need the mute button. So I instinctively put mute when I'm supposed to speak. It's great to see you, Jesse. Great to see you, Kip. And how wonderful it was to find out of your connection with each other. So I'm here in solidarity.
Welcome. All right, well, we will go ahead and get started. I've also turned on the live captioning. I hope that's not too distracting. I hope it's helpful for folks. But welcome to our program, Women, Work, and Activism in the Coal Mines, Stories from the Women Miners Oral History Project, featuring Jesse Wilkerson, Emily Walter, and hopefully some of the miners. I'm Lori Hostuttler, the Interim Director of the West Virginia and Regional History Center at West Virginia University Libraries, and I thank you all for being here today. So our program today is part of the West Virginia Feminist Activist Collection Project, an initiative of the West Virginia and Regional History Center. The project is collecting the records and voices of people and organizations who have worked to improve the lives of women in the state. We are especially committed to documenting the stories of people of color, people from the LGBTQ community, and other marginalized groups. Ultimately, these materials and oral history interviews will be open to the public for research and study, and they will be used in teaching and learning at WVU and beyond. In addition to the collecting initiative, the project is also hosting educational programs that highlight the importance of archives, like our program today. It is important to note that this work is being sponsored by the West Virginia Humanities Council and the WVU Humanities Center. I'd like you all to check out the West Virginia Feminist Activist Collection webpage on the History Center's website for more information about our project overall. And you can also view recordings of previous programs, including West Virginia History Makers, Black Women's Activism in the Archives, Engaging the Queer Feminist Archive, and also Don't Throw It Out, a conversation about documenting women. I'll drop the links to those web pages in the chat shortly. But first, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Jesse Wilkerson is the Joyce and Stuart Robbins Chair and Associate Professor of History at West Virginia University. Her first book, To Live Here, You Have to Fight, How Women Led Appalachian Movements for Social Justice, was published in 2019. She is currently working on two book projects focused on women's history and was named a Carnegie Fellow for 2022 and 23. Emily Walter is pursuing a master's in public history at WVU. She studies the history of Appalachia, particularly labor and the environment. So I will hand the program over to our very capable speakers, Jesse and Emily. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. Emily, do you want to get our PowerPoint up?
Yeah, give me like 2 seconds.
Okay, while Emily's doing that, I just want to welcome everyone. And again, thank Lori for inviting me and Emily to give this talk and to share this research that we've been working on. Let's see, is that, Emily, do you want to click to the next one? Let's see if it's cutting off the bottom of your screen.
It kind of looks like it is for me because there's like the bottom bar and it won't let me skip to the next one in like 5 seconds.
Okay. We just want to make sure we have this working before we get going. We want to give you a good presentation here. But let me also just add my welcome to everyone who's here. It's good to see so many familiar faces and also some new names and faces.
Does that look good?
Oh yeah, that's better. Yeah. Well, it went back down, but that's okay. I think it'll be fine, Emily.
Okay, now I just need to figure out how to skip to the next slide because like there's no arrows or anything.
Maybe if you hit the space bar or the...
We might have to do it outside of presentation mode because that seems to be the issue, like when I get to presentation mode, but you'll still see the slides just at like 66% scale.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes that's the issue. Okay. Sorry, everybody. You would think that we had have nailed down Zoom, but it's not always as simple as it seems.
We literally practiced this beforehand too. Like, oh, it works perfect.
Yeah, but we do want to make sure you can see the presentation because we have beautiful photographs to share that Merritt Moore took. And so you can see that one on the opening page there. Okay, so this will work fine. So I just want to start by telling you how we started this project. In December 2020, several colleagues forwarded me an email that included a message from Kip Dawson, who's here this evening. Kip is an activist, educator, and lifelong organizer, as well as a former coal miner. And the message began, quote, "3 friends and I have been wrestling with a people's history obligation we all feel we have." And I love that quote, and it's how the email started. And so, of course, I read on. And Kip had asked another people's historian, Marcus Rediker, to help put her in touch with scholars. She was in search of those who might be interested in helping to tell the story of women coal miners. Her email, which was just this beautifully written text, described a rich history of grassroots leadership in the United Mine Workers, how women organized beyond the union and the Women Led Coal Employment Project, and how we can better understand what Kip called the peak and decline of the labor movement in the United States through the history of organized women miners. Other scholars had forwarded this message to me because they knew that my first book was about women and grassroots movements in the Appalachian coal fields. And after reading this email, of course, I wanted to know more about Kip Dawson and all the women that she was writing about and telling us about. So before long, I had a meeting with Kip and her comrades, Merritt Moore, Libby Lindsay, and Betty Jean Hall. We discussed how to begin the process of preserving the stories of women who were miners starting in the late 1970s, following landmark feminist policies that opened up workplaces once closed to women. I want to be clear that their aim was about much more than celebrating how women broke down barriers to exclusively male workplaces during the second wave of the women's movement, even though their stories are, of course, a part of that history. Rather, theirs is a collective story about class and gender struggle and histories of labor, race, politics, and the successes, limitations, and contradictions inherent in feminist policies in our capitalist systems. Out of those initial conversations grew the Women Miners Oral History Project, one component of the larger West Virginia Feminist Activist Collection working group that Lori introduced at the start of this presentation. If you're interested in learning more about or contributing to the West Virginia Feminist Activist Collection, please reach out or click on the links that Lori's providing. And I also just want to take a minute to thank all the people who've helped make this work possible. And that includes the members of that working group, in particular, Judah Stitzel, Carol Wilkerson, Susan Kelly, as well as Lori. And I also want to thank Joyce and Stuart Robbins, who helped to fund this Women Miners Oral History Project, as well as the Andrew Carnegie Foundation and the West Virginia Humanities Council for their support. And then, of course, this project would not be possible without the participation of graduate student researchers who've been a sheer delight to work with. They are Elizabeth Moore, Megan Mayo, V. Konopka, and Emily Walter, who, of course, is my co-presenter this evening. And then we couldn't do any of this work without the support and enthusiasm of the women miners and their supporters who have so far agreed to be interviewed or expressed interest in being interviewed. They are Merritt Moore, Kip Dawson, Libby Lindsay, Betty Jean Hall, Lisa Parnell Christensen, Tammy Brock, Bonnie Boyer, Jody Hogue, Goldie Kaiser, Doris Megan, Linda Rasevich Parsons, and Carol Davis Jones, whose passing in September we mourn, although knowing her history, we suspect she would say to us, "Don't mourn, organize." This evening, Emily Walter, public history master's student, is going to share more with you about the interview process and what she's learned from working on this project. Before she does that, I want to share a few key takeaways from the interviews we've collected so far, including some concepts that help us understand the broader significance of these interviews. This, I can tell you, is going to be the most boring part of this presentation, but I do want to take just a minute to talk about some historical concepts that I think provide a frame for understanding why we're doing these interviews and what they help us to think about. So first, I want to talk a little bit about social reproduction. And you may be wondering, like, what do I mean when I say social reproduction? The scholar T.D. Bhattacharya explains that social reproduction is the human labor that's at the heart of creating or reproducing society as a whole. It's the labor that happens in homes, hospitals, schools, daycares, and all the spaces in between. It's always shaped by social relations, including those of class, race, gender, and citizenship status. In several of the interviews that we've collected, and in fact, I'll just go ahead and say almost all of them, we hear stories about women who fought for jobs in the mines because those jobs would better help them support their children. And that's mining as a social reproduction issue. Needing a job to support children and that being the motivating factor is partly about providing for a family. And then when women organized with the wives of coal miners in strikes around shared interests, we can also see there an expression of social reproduction or people fighting for the ability to reproduce human life under more just conditions. The second point I want to make is that labor struggle happens just as much along those lines of social reproduction as more familiar labor activism, like strikes for better pay or work conditions. We're calling this project the Women Miners Oral History Project, and in that naming, we're privileging that aspect of women's lives that carried them into the mines and into a workplace that is undisputed territory of industrial labor. But these interviews are just as easily linked by the stories that women shared about how the labor of social reproduction overlapped with the labor that they did in the mines, as well as the class struggle that emerged around socially reproductive labor. And this brings me to my third and related point. Women in the mines organized in ways that addressed both of these areas of labor, socially reproductive and work at the point of production, that is the work in the mines that made a profit for coal operators. And anyone who knows my works, knows my scholarship and work, knows that this is something I find really exciting about these stories and about this history. By their physical presence, and soon enough, their activism and organizing, women miners disrupted the commonly held belief that the worker is only a worker or only participates in class struggle in her place of work, that the labor in all other spaces is on the margins of class struggle. And I'll just highlight here Carol Davis Jones' interview. I mentioned earlier that Carol Davis passed earlier this year, and we're really honored and really grateful that she shared her story with us. She did 2 interviews with Elizabeth Moore. And her story helps us to see some of these concepts I'm talking about. A lifelong labor activist, Carol talked about how, as a young mother at 17, she was in a position of caring for her daughter all on her own. Her journey into wage work started with washing dishes and then working in a daycare until one of her aunts told her about jobs in the mines in Pennsylvania, where she was hired in 1976. Carol would have made more than she could have ever imagined in her new job. She also changed the workplace with her very presence. She worked in the mines during 2 pregnancies. One of those pregnancies was with twins. And so it's not surprising that she went on to work on a parental leave policy in the United Mine Workers contract, something she talked about in her interviews. She also worked on what became the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993, which became a source of pride. And in her interview, Carol told this great story about having a conversation with the president of her union local. And he said that the law had a snowball's chance in hell of passing. And so when Clinton signed that piece of legislation, Carol called him and said, well, it's snowing in hell. A story that is just so wonderful. So for women like Carol, the fight for maternal and parental leave emerged out of class struggle and was informed deeply by her experiences as a Black working woman. Parental leave is not often categorized as part of class and labor struggle. It's often not categorized as something that Black women led. Instead, it's cast as somewhat different, the realm of career and professional women who promoted middle-class feminist interests. But for women miners, it was a struggle over time, over when and how men and women work, under what conditions, and what work at the point of production means for our socially reproductive labor. So I'll just wrap up my comments here by noting the significance of feminist history as well as people's history, and the way that these interviews, the body of interviews, which we hope to share with you in the coming year or so, help us understand. So in these interviews are lessons in how to organize a union, how to organize outside of the union around struggles for justice, how to organize with women all over the country and the world, and how political consciousness changes in collective movements. Okay, so there's like the big concepts that I'm thinking about as a historian, but I'm now delighted to turn this talk over to Emily Walter, who has been a dream to work with. She's approached this work with thoughtfulness, integrity, dedication, and a commitment to working class women's and labor history. And I'm thrilled that you all will get to hear from her this evening. Emily.
Dr. Wilkerson didn't put that little nice part about me in our shared document, so that was a surprise to me, but thank you for saying such nice things. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about the process of what the Women Miners Oral History Project looks like on a day-to-day basis, interacting with the lovely women miners, many of whom you see here tonight. But in order to do that, it's important to understand what oral history is and why it might be different than other conceptions of interviewing, like journalistic interviews. So I pulled a definition from the Oral History Association that describes oral history as a recording of a first-person account, so essentially a person sharing their stories with you, made by an interviewer and a narrator, both of whom have the intention of creating a permanent record, the audio recording and the transcript or the video, that contributes to our understanding of the past. So I bolded the ideas that feel really important to me as a narrator, having these moments of interaction with women like Merritt and Lisa Parnell Christensen, where we are collaborating together to make a record of the past that contributes to how we understand our shared history. And our framework for this project specifically comes from a period of oral history where things are coming up from the bottom as opposed to a top-down approach to taking stories. So social movements of the 1960s and 70s, specifically women's rights movements, LGBTQ movements, civil rights movements, they're turning to oral history as a tool to capture underrepresented experiences of marginalized people in the historical record, people who have traditionally been left out from the historical record. And since this time period of the 60s and 70s, oral history projects have kind of been most often led by community members, led and staffed by non-academic, non-professional community members, because oral history has this power to enhance our shared understanding of a time and a place. So many communities are looking to oral history as a way to understand themselves better and then share that knowledge of themselves with others. It's a chance to represent themselves in history when they've otherwise been excluded. So oral history can also be a partnership between institutions like museums and libraries and universities and the communities whose stories are being recorded as part of the project. So that's essentially the situation that we're in, where Dr. Wilkerson and I on the WVU side are collaborating with women miners to make this shared archive of women miners history. So this project has kind of naturally developed in this framework of feminist oral history, where both parties are working together to share these stories that we understand as important to the history of working class women. And it gives us new understandings of mining history, of the labor movement, and like Dr. Wilkerson mentioned, of social reproduction. And with that, there's a kind of natural back and forth between us on the WVU side and the women miners, and whatever like power or authority there is in a oral history project, like we're sharing that together. So we are essentially co-creating these sources of history that have been missing so far. So I want to use my experience, women miner in particular, named Merritt Moore, to show you how our project operates on a logistical level, but I also think my experiences with Merritt show the type of special relationship that you can form through oral history with a person like Merritt when you're taking this feminist oral history approach. So the list of potential narrators for our project was and still is, it's actively being populated by women miners themselves. So Kip and Merritt and Libby and Betty Jean, they all email one another and us, and they say, this person seems like someone who has stories to tell. We should contact them and see if they're ready. So they'll do the work of kind of advocating for us, establishing a relationship, and then we'll kind of get looped in and we can start talking to a potential narrator from there. And on that initial list of people that Kip and Merritt and Libby gave to us was Merritt herself. And Merritt, again, spoke with Dr. Wilkerson really early on about collaborating for this project. So she's a core member of this group of women miners, and her stories are really important to the history. So Merritt is a former mine worker. She worked in the U.S. steel mine in, I think, 1979 to 1980. She was a former journalist at the United Mine Workers Journal. She was a CEP member, that's the Coal Employment Project, which Dr. Wilkerson referenced in the kind of introductory remarks. And I'm also going to give her the designation as like all-around political agitator. And she authored the book Women in the Mines, which is a collection of oral histories that Merritt conducted with women miners as far back as like the early 20th century through that later CEP era of the 70s and 80s and 90s. So Dr. Wilkerson trusted me to work with Merritt, which felt really daunting at first because Merritt is such an accomplished oral historian and storyteller. But we exchanged contact information and we had a little introductory phone call to talk about the project and get to know one another. And that really calmed my nerves because I quickly learned that Merritt, like every woman that I've ever spoken to as part of this project, is so delightful and kind. So the first thing Merritt did was she emailed me a whole collection of articles that she had written in the United Mine Workers Journal or the East Tennessee State University's magazine Now and Then, and even some of her poetry that she had written about mining history. So my first goal was like read about Merritt's life. And I was learning about this larger historical context of moments that Merritt participated in and she was shaped by. But by reading her writing, I also got a little glimpse of who Merritt is, because what she wrote about and how she wrote about it said something about her values and personality to me. So that was important for me to get a little glimpse of Merritt Moore before going into this interview process. So then Merritt shared with me a timeline of the major events of her life, which I imagine must have taken a lot of time and effort to curate however many years of her life into a little timeline for me to know all of the backstory. So I cut a little example of her timeline and put it up there in the top left corner. And it goes pretty much like through present day. And I can tell you that Merritt's accomplished a lot. So I was kind of naive and I was like, I can chunk this up into 5 interviews. And we can cover Merritt's whole life in that amount of time, and it'll be great. It'll be done by the end of summer. And I presented her this plan of like, what if we did this interview is this 6 years of your life, and here's the major events that fall within it. And this next interview will be the next 5 years of your life and the major events that fall within that time period. And I sent it to Merritt and she was like, I think you're a little overzealous with some of these. So you can see in the orange there that she gave me feedback, like we might want to break this into 2 interviews. And I was like, okay, that sounds like a good idea. We had this kind of rough outline of what we wanted to do for each interview with the understanding that it was flexible. So to prepare for our first interview together, I made an interview guide, which is just a list of open-ended questions to kind of spark conversation. And Merritt reviewed her own personal archive of all the photos she's taken and her handwritten journals that she has wrote since the age of 15. So she went way back in her own archive. Merritt is a self-described documentarian and a very thorough one at that. So we both did research to prepare for our first interview together. And then we had our first interview together, and we realized that trying to squeeze her very vivid, detailed stories into 5 interviews was going to restrict what we were able to cover. And the goal was to talk about as much as Merritt wanted to talk about on the record. And Dr. Wilkerson talked about this, that we're kind of taking a life history approach to these interviews, where we think that anything that a woman miner like Merritt wants to share about is valuable to her story and to these patterns in history. So it's not just about the stories of work underground in the mine, although that's part of it, but we're interested in the full breadth of who Merritt is and her life, because it all says something historically important. So then we decided to adapt the interview plan by kind of just not following it at all. So basically, we came prepared for each interview with an interview guide that had some questions that were based on where we left off with the last interview. So we had this interview breakdown plan. We knew that it was a little too narrow and we just needed more time. And we took as much time as we felt like we needed for Merritt to fully cover everything she wanted in that time period. And where we left off, we just picked up the next time. So for an example, the Massey strike, which was a coal miners' strike in 1984 and 1985, we spent 2 whole interviews on that period of time and Merritt's involvement in it and what she thought about it, where I think beforehand I had that sectioned into like 1 interview with like 8 other things. So we were really going back and forth about like how much time Merritt felt like she needed, and I made adjustments on my end to make sure that we got everything important to her story on the record. So this is an ongoing process. Merritt and I are not done interviewing together. We've made it through the mid-1980s, which we have a lot of life to cover to 2022. So we have many more interviews to do together. We have 6 recorded interviews right now. Some are like an hour and a half, and some are nearly 3 hours. It just depends on how chatty we're feeling that day. But I wanted to show you that each interview kind of looks like this. So it's Merritt and I on Zoom together. I introduce us for the recording. I say a little sentence about where we left off for the previous interview for anyone who's referencing this in the archive and thinks, oh, I should go back to the previous interview. And then we talk about where we decided to head today. And then I give the floor to Merritt. And she's a real self-starter who doesn't need like any poking to share, which makes her a unique narrator. But sometimes I slip in and I ask how she felt about something, or if she can clarify what that meant, or go a little deeper with the story. And together, that back and forth, we make a rich historical record that captures the context that Merritt lived and worked in, and how she internally and externally responded to her surroundings. So her stories are showing us not only what happened in history, but what a woman miner journalist like Merritt thought about what happened, both in the past and today. And then after each interview, I begin the process of transcribing the audio, which Merritt cautioned me is a major time sink. And I've had a little bit of experience transcribing, but when you have a 3-hour, like really rich, exciting interview, you spend a lot of time with it. So after I transcribe the interview, I'll send it to Merritt, and I'll ask if there's any names or sections that she wants removed from the audio or the transcript. She'll go through and correct any misspellings of people's names or place names, and she comments on things that I've missed. And this back and forth in the transcript process is about as like collaborative as the interview itself. It would not be possible without the feedback of Merritt, because together we're making another piece of the historical record that accompanies the audio itself, and researchers or any interested person can go through and read the conversation and learn from the transcript itself. So it is wholeheartedly a product of teamwork. But that teamwork feels really inherent to the type of people that I've learned CEP women are. From what I've gathered from conversations with Merritt and Kip and Betty Jean and all the other remarkable women, they seem to believe in sharing space with and supporting the work and interests of other women. They value meaningful relationships that are founded on mutual respect and care and solidarity, and I certainly have felt that from Merritt. She's supported me in developing my skills as an oral historian. She's taught me about labor organizing and Appalachian history, but most importantly, I think Merritt has taught me how to be a good sister to other women. And I wanted to share some stories from my conversations with her that really stick out to me even months after we first recorded them. So I'll show you some exciting pictures now. So both stories that I want to tell are from that period of the Massey strike in the early to mid 1980s. It was 1984 and 1985 in Eastern Kentucky and Southern West Virginia in Mingo County. And the strike had a lot of really dark moments for the miners and their families, but Merritt brought a little bit of light to a struggling picket line with some protest art. So the Samoyed picket line, Merritt was telling me, is outside the Samoyed Energy mine. And this picket line in particular was lined with sandbags as a protective barrier for the striking miners. A woman miner there named Judy was actually shot and injured when she was in the sandbag picket shack across the entrance from the mine. At night, there were searchlights flying overhead of the line, and the miners were pretty scared and demoralized. But then somebody whipped out a fiddle, and Merritt was standing on the picket line with the miners, despite the fact that her boss at the UMWA said that he wouldn't go to the Samoyed picket line. She began clog dancing to the fiddle. And then others joined her. And then the whole line of people were like hooting and hollering and clapping and clog dancing. And the music and the dance together sort of broke the anxious tension that they were all holding in from this like violent situation. And it helped them hold that picket line for another day. It kept their spirits high enough to keep going. So clog dancing was an art that Merritt brought to protest throughout her organizing career. It has been something that's come up in multiple stories she's told me. And I can see her meshing this traditional dance with class struggle in a really special way. And as far as I know, last time I talked to Merritt, she said she's still clog dancing. So another story from the Massey strike really shows Merritt's commitment to sisterhood. So Merritt was working at the United Mine Workers office in DC, and she was making the really long drive from her home in the DC area to Blackberry Creek down in that area of the Massey strike to support the wives and children of striking miners. Specifically, Merritt was going to Hazel's beauty parlor, but not to get her hair done. She was going there because it became a center for women's organizing in the coal field during the Massey strike. So the photo on the right side of the slide is the outside of Hazel's beauty shop with a handmade pro-union banner. And Merritt described the atmosphere of the beauty shop as kind of like a woman's bathhouse in the mine, where it was a safe place for conversation where you knew that men weren't about to burst in at any moment. So women got together there to complain about things. They complained about the overloaded coal trucks that were barreling down the roads that their kids lived on and played on. And they were complaining about the fact that they were totally cut off from all of the information about the strike. They wanted to know what was happening and how they could support their striking neighbors and husbands and brothers and friends and fathers. So Merritt kind of became this like bridge between the union and the family. And she faced a ton of resistance from her supervisors at the United Mine Workers for going down to Blackberry Creek so often and not being in the office. But she was also pushing the recognition of the needs of miners' families, which was moving the UMWA forward and really helping to carve out a space for women in the union movement. So all of the photos that you've seen tonight were taken by Merritt, with the exception of like the screenshot of our faces on Zoom. And I wanted to share a few of Merritt's images that hint at like the unique forms of solidarity that women miners have with others in and out of their workplace. So this is a theme we're seeing in interviews themselves, but they come out really clearly in Merritt's photographs. So the first couple photos are going to show the relationships that women miners have with one another. So this is a photo of Vera and a coworker in a mine in McDowell County, West Virginia. Merritt told me that Vera was a section boss who tried her best to take care of her crew, and you can see that in the smiles that they're giving each other right there. The second photo, we don't know the names of these people, but we know that it's women miners in a bathhouse being friendly with one another in Alabama. And you can really just feel like the joy and like platonic love radiating off of this photo. So I really enjoy this one. The next photo is also in a bathhouse. These women worked second shift in the Mary Lee No. 2 mine in Alabama in the early 1980s. And I picked these two bathhouse photos because Merritt said, as part of her own experience as a miner, that the bathhouse was really the only place to meet other women miners who weren't working directly with you underground. So because of the interaction you'd have with other women miners from other shifts, it became kind of the social hub for interacting with other women in the mine and building solidarity with one another, which you can really see in this photograph. And I like these three pictures together because they kind of show how gender solidarity often crossed racial lines, certainly, but also class lines, that the section boss had a good relationship with other women in the mine, despite that power differential. They were in solidarity with one another because they were women in a male-dominated space. So the next two photos show the relationships that women had with men in the mine. And not every experience with men was rosy. A lot of interviews talk about difficulties with men, especially related to sexual harassment, but women often still had solidarity with men in the mine, like these two photos show. So on the left is Sheila, and she's with her friend on the long wall section in a mine in West Virginia. And Merritt said that the dust was really thick in this photograph because of the long wall mining, and that she guesses the man was a tailgate operator. And on the right is a really special photo of Betty Jo, who is Merritt's friend, and her father, Mackie Dew, in 1979. They both worked at a U.S. steel mine, number 20, in Thacker, West Virginia. So they had a very special bond. And then the next couple of photos are going to show the relationship that women had with others in a caring way, that social reproductive work in and outside of the mine. So we're going to return to this sweet photo of Carol Davis Jones. She's standing here with her 3 children in 1992 in Waynesburg, Pennsylvania. And the next photo is of Evie, a Navajo woman. This is her and her daughter in Kayenta, Arizona, in Navajo Nation in 1986. Evie was a CEP member and a UMWA member, and Merritt says that she drove a water truck at Peabody Mine on the sacred Black Mesa, and she was a water protector. So I think these photos as a collective really show that solidarity meant something unique to women miners. It wasn't just like a term for union membership. It really meant in concrete ways standing with others and loving them platonically and giving them the care that they deserve and looking out for one another. So to return to the interviewing that Merritt and I have done together, I've certainly benefited from my relationship with Merritt, but I think Merritt has too, just in different ways than me. So I'll sometimes get like emails from her, or she'll tell me the next time we talk on the phone or do an interview together that this project has encouraged her to reconsider the importance of certain events that we've talked about on her life trajectory and getting her where she is today. And it pushed her to read her own journals going back to the age of 15 and sit with kind of uncomfortable moments or political struggles or really genuine friendships. And in preparing for this specific presentation, I reached out to Merritt to ask about using some of her photographs. And then she mailed me projector slides, which as like a kid of the late 1990s, was like mind-blowing to get in the mail, these like little tiny cartridges of photos and hold them up to the light. It was so special to see, but she had to go through this process of deciding which photos to share and really like spend time with her collection of her own photos. And she told me that doing this process kind of helped her see her own photos as art, that they captured a slice of women's history and mining history that wasn't really represented in the work of other photographers in this era, probably because of like her unique position as a former women miner and a UMWA journalist. So she had access to that realm of women miners, that spontaneity of women miners' experiences in the bathhouse that other photographers at the time might not have. So she's adding something to the historical record with her photographs. And I'm glad that this process helped her see the value in her work, because as you all can see, there's great value to these photos. So I think together, Merritt and I are learning a lot about ourselves and about the past, and certainly about the future. So every oral history interview process varies because it's totally dependent on the personalities and the stories of the two people that are interacting. But every interview that I have done with the women miners has been something like Merritt's. They've all felt incredibly warm, they've felt deeply personal and wholly reciprocal. So I've been really grateful to learn from these women, and I have so much more learning to do. And I thank you all for the support of the People's History Project that the CEP women have started and we now get to participate in.
Thank you, Emily. I hope that you all are getting a sense of like the love and joy that's a part of this project, because it really, really does feel that way. Emily, if you want to stop sharing the screen, we want to leave some time now to hear from any of the women miners, former women miners who are here this evening. We just want to leave some space in case you all want to say anything. I know Kip is here, Merritt and Betty Jean. Don't know if Libby is here. Libby is here. Okay. We're so glad you're here, Libby. And Lisa Parnell Christensen, did she make it in? No, okay. Merritt, would you like to say anything? You're muted right now.
Sorry, I'm kind of in a public space. Sorry. I just want to apologize to Emily, which I do a lot because, you know, I've gone on and on in our interviews and having interviewed, you know, about 78 women miners over the years, earlier decades, she and I have talked about this experience. So I remember when I would leave interviews and spending time, maybe a day or two with the family or in going back, how I would leave just so inspired. And then when I was interviewing with Emily, she was saying the same thing. And I was saying, I'd have to get my stuff together and remember everything and go back to the journals. And I would say, oh my gosh, I'm kind of wiped out after the interview. So did I leave, you know, all these people tired out after I left? You know, so it kind of, you know, it gave me a different perspective. And I think I've just appreciated the difference in being older. And I think Kip and I have talked about that, you know, being at this age, and Carol also, and Libby, you know, when you're older, but you're not yet either demented or unable to do things, it's such a different perspective on, for example, with Betty Jean and CEP, the older I get, the more I appreciate how completely unique the Coal Employment Project was, how it ran parallel with United Mine Workers, but how really there was more energy, more interest, how men came to those CEP conferences more and more, because CEP conferences were addressing things that men wanted to know in the mine workers and beyond. So anyway, I just want to say that Emily is just an incredible delight to work with. And I'm just feeling, I don't want to wear out my welcome with you, Emily.
You could never Merritt. If I'm tired, it's just from smiling. I'm so excited to work with you. And I think it's spectacular that you go on and on and on. And like, I'm enjoying every single second of it. I hope I have that come across because it is so fun to talk to you.
Yeah, go ahead, Kip.
Okay, thank you. I am overwhelmed, and that doesn't happen as much as it is happening to me right now by learning things that I didn't know that I would be learning tonight. And that always happens when I'm around Jesse and Lori and Emily, because the points that are being driven home here is about the reciprocal relationship of this endeavor, or something that I didn't anticipate when I kind of desperately sent that email out that Jesse read at the beginning. The motivation that brought Libby and Merritt and me together at the dining room table in my house to try and figure out how we could accomplish, while our women were still living, getting their stories told. The motivation came to all of us for the same kinds of reasons. We had been lucky enough to live through the processes that brought us together from very different places and made us know that that the stories that we had a chance to participate in and observe during our times as coal miners were important parts of history that would not be told if they weren't being told by the people who had made them happen. And this process that you at WVU have made happen, and Emily, the wonderful way that you reported on that just makes it so clear, is kind of like the soul of the kinds of things that Jessie Wilkerson wrote about in her book about the caring the concept of care, the culture of care that is so absolutely critical if the human race is going to continue, and that can come out as a real thing, mostly through stories like these that are being shared among women who have made them happen that normally just don't get told. And there's many things that can be said about that. But this is just such a phenomenal thing. But I think that one of the things that we really must make known is that we would not have known each other, we women miners, and we would not have been able to come to the conclusion that we needed to have this work done. And we wouldn't have been able to find the WVU people if it were not for Betty Jean Hall, who was with us tonight. Because what we had, in addition to the experiences that we had in our own coal mines and in United Mine Workers activities, was every year we had a conference of women coal miners that was organized by the Coal Employment Project, that in its initial formation was a group that Betty Jean knew was important to, as she in her work as an attorney, to help women get into the mines and hold on to jobs. She very early on came to the conclusion that women miners themselves should organize the work that was being done. And she turned over to us the project that turned into a monthly newsletter that is in itself incredible history, and sharing the responsibility around the country. The groups of women miners existed in Alabama or the Navajo land, or in West Virginia or Pennsylvania, took the responsibility of organizing a conference that women miners and those who supported us from around the country could come to. We had a family, and we took that family home with us. And those women who were working without many other women in their mines, or in a situation that wasn't as friendly as where I had a great union local to work with, that could continue their lives feeling that sisterhood. And that is something that nobody else had. We're working now with women construction workers who are resurrecting their history. And they didn't have this kind of mechanism. And they can see, and we can see together, how absolutely essential it was for us. And Emily, we couldn't come to you with these stories if it were not for Betty Jean, who's sitting right here. I can see her. I'm hoping that she will say something too, because it underscores all the points that Jesse Wilkerson, that was incredible, Jesse, what you said, that Jesse and Emily have made here tonight, and that Merritt has made too. And that is that this is a reciprocal thing. There's no stars in this. I bet you haven't found a single woman miner who thinks of herself as a star. We all think of ourselves as part of something much bigger than ourselves. And one of us, two of us together is more than two. It's energy that you are doing such a great job of collecting. And let me just say, Merritt and I discovered each other collecting history from the time that we started working in the mines. Both of us were set on making sure that the stories that we knew were going on could be told from the people who made them happen. I got that from my mom. My mom was Rosie the Riveter during World War II. And she worked in a factory while I was growing up. And she was a union activist. And she was working at a time when women's voices were not heard. And she, above all, anything, she dreamed of a time when Virginia Woolf's story about a room of one's own could be told by working class women, and they could tell their stories too. Her hero was Tilly Olson and Tilly Olson's fiction, which was the only place that she could go to see any of those things being told. How proud she would be of you, Emily, and of the work that is being done here. That email that it was signed by me, that one that Jesse wrote, but it was a product of collaboration, as everything we did was. And we're carrying forward the work of previous generations and handing them to your generation, Emily, and you're going to make them possible for other people's in the future to be able to not only tell their stories, but to know that they are important and to know that collectively they're important. So maybe if Betty Jean could tell us something about how we all got to be together.
I'm trying to get my mute off. Sorry about that. When you were talking about the newsletters, the monthly newsletters, they were so important in my mind, because not only did it give every month the news of what was going on with legal cases or with, whatever, support group meetings or whatever it was, in every issue, there was a portrait story of a woman miner, which included an actual picture of her, but more importantly, a 3 or 4 page legal single space page. And it was like they were talking to each other. They were revealing so much of their lives, so much of themselves. And it just really helped everybody to see it's not just me. And one of the women told me once, said, that newsletter is my friend that shows up in the mailbox every month. And that to me was an important thing, because you all did a lot of the writing from your own perspective in the story.
How about Libby? Are you out there? Maybe Libby had to leave. Oh, there you are, Libby. Hey, Libby.
Get my camera set. Cut my head off. Oh, well, you don't need to see me to hear me. Oh my gosh. I'm doing these interviews had me so wishing that that I had any of Kip and Merritt's organization, and where they have journaled, but because I don't remember so much stuff. And then we're talking about stuff and I'm like, dang, I hadn't thought about that in 1,000 years. Oh, and then there was this and this. And even though it's a collective history, each of us had a different window on it. And it's so important to have that each, like a panorama. We're scanning around and we're just like, yeah, and remember this, and did you see that? And here's what this helped that and contributed to this. And this is such an important thing to be able to present to young women and say, this happened and you can do this, and so much more. Had to laugh when Kip's talking about Betty Jean. You could suggest something to her and she'd say, that's a great idea, you do that. And organizing the conferences in each area forced us to learn other skills than roof bolting. It was a really growing important thing. And I am so excited to share these memories, and not just looking at the past, but with an eye on the present and the future. Thank you all so much for all your work.
Thank you, Libby.
Somebody mentioned medical leave or family leave, and part of women miners had a really important role in that, because there was a lot of women's groups at the time in the late 70s, early 80s, women's groups working on mainly maternity leave. And it started out with the women miners, we need maternity leave, we can't keep working, our doctors say we can't keep working. And then it wasn't long before some of them said, wait a minute, it should be maternity paternity leave, because if we're going to get support from the guys, you can remind them that babies do get born during hunting season. So then it became maternity paternity, and before long the national women's groups were wanting the women miners involved because they desperately needed the support of a male dominated union. And you all can tell that better than I can, but I know Carol Davis was very much involved in that. Maybe I can't remember exactly who else, but before it was a struggle to get the UMW support. But the fact that we made up paternity leave, well, that made it different. And before the Senate, U.S. Senate committee, some of the strongest testimony came from two UMW folks, one of whom had had a child dying of cancer and having to take him for chemo treatments in Morgantown. And when they took off, they didn't know if they were going to be going for a couple of days or much longer, but he couldn't get the time off and was faced with the choice of quitting his job, which his insurance was held with for their child, or not spending time with his son. And another one was, I'd say, a middle-aged gentleman who had grown kids but had adopted an infant and wanted time to spend with that infant. We were told that that was some of the most powerful there. And before long, it evolved into family leave, because if you do it for your, then mothers and fathers and family members, well, what if not family members? Why not yourself? So the women miners were an integral part of getting what we all know today as family leave. End of story.
I would add that the role of men in the male miners, I remember going to the United Mine Workers Journal and talking to them about coverage of this family leave campaign. And what they did was they agreed to have a cover for Rank and File Speaks of, what was his name, Libby? Fred Deskins? I can't remember. The guy who had the young child dying of cancer. So that was a really key thing of having men step up and saying, yes, we need this too. That was a way of influencing the UMWA. So that was very, very well handled, I think, by everybody. And Cosby was involved in that, and others. So yeah.
But I think this needs to be added. The reason that the United Mine Workers as an international union brought this to Congress was because women in locals around the country got their locals to approve a resolution at a United Mine Workers convention calling for this to happen. And the reason that could happen is that we got together at co-employment project conferences where the whole idea was developed and put together. So it probably may be the most, the best representative of something specific that came out of the co-employment project and became national law. And that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the fact that we had mechanisms in which we could bring together this caring culture that we developed at these conferences and bring it back to our locals. My local, Libby's local, adopted resolutions calling on the union to do this. And that happened all over the United States. So here, now we have it.
And we made sure that weekend when we got the women together that we had somebody, I believe, from every UMWA district, or almost all of it. And before the weekend was out, and it was a weekend, I mean, just 2 or 3 days, you all had drafted the language, agreed upon it. This is the resolution we want before the UMWA convention. And then you all went back home and pushed it in every UMWA district. And from there it went. And it did become sort of a resolution out of the next UMWA convention. Not quite as strong as we asked for, maybe, but it was strong.
So we're right at an hour and 8 o'clock. So I want to respect the people's time. I think we said we'd be on for an hour here. I think this is all, I love this. This is just amazing to hear you all reflect on the history of the Family and Medical Leave Act. I think the lesson here is find yourself an organization like the Co-Employment Project. And if you don't have one, organize one, and organize, right? That's the lesson. If we want this universal caregiver model expanded, you all provided a model for how to do that. And we know there's still work to be done. So I just want to thank Emily again. I want to thank Merritt, especially for letting us share and tell your stories, and Kip and Betty Jean and Libby and all the other amazing women. Thanks to Lori for the invitation to share the work and to be part of the West Virginia Feminist Activist Collection. And yeah, Lori, do you want to say anything about upcoming events?
So we will have another one of these programs in the spring. Our date is still a little bit TBD, but our next speaker, we will end this series with Judith Stitzel, who has been a part of this project, as part of the West Virginia Feminist Activist Collection Project since the beginning. And I do encourage everyone to go back and check out some of the other programs that we've put together. They're just fantastic. And as Jesse mentioned earlier, so we've talked a lot about the oral histories, but we're also interested in collecting records that include like the photographs like Merritt had shared, but any other kind of correspondence or ephemeral items, programs, flyers, all that kind of stuff. We seek to add that to the Regional History Center. We already have coal mining collections here, and some women's collections, but these records will, new records will enrich what is here and tell different sides of the story and tell stories that haven't been told. So I encourage you all to reach out, hit the center's website and send me an email. So thank you guys so much for the program. It was just wonderful and inspiring, and it's going to take a little bit to come down from the energy and go to bed tonight. So thank you all so much.